In this video, I'm going to go over the difference between random sampling and random assignment. These two terms are very easy to confuse, especially if they're learning about them for the first time. It's common for students to use one term when they actually mean the other, at least from time to time. So in this video, I really want to help you understand that these are two separate ideas. They're not the same thing. And in this video, I'm going to go over a few important points about random sampling. I'm going to go over a few important points about random assignment. And as I go down my list, I'm going to do my best to help you see the difference between random sampling and random assignment. So let's start with, well, first I need to mention that random sampling and random assignment are not typically done in the same study. It's not typical for them to be done together. I can actually only think of one specific type of research in which random sampling and random assignment would both be done in the same study. Random sampling is common in certain types of survey research in which it's very important to get a representative, high-quality sample. In some types of survey research, it's very important to get a high-quality, unbiased sample because if the sample is bad, there's going to be severe consequences. An example of that type of situation is a political poll or a political survey. When a researcher is doing a political poll and the researcher is trying to find out who's likely to win in an election, it's important for the researcher to get a good sample, because if the sample is bad, then the public is going to be misled. The public might think that a certain candidate is ahead in the election when actually another candidate is ahead in the election. To avoid that, the researcher would do his or her best to get a high quality sample, and the researcher would use random sampling so that the researcher would have the best possible chance of getting that high quality sample. Random assignment is done in experimental research. It's done in experiments. Random assignment is actually a defining feature of an experiment. A study is not an experiment if it doesn't have random assignment in its procedure. So, like I said, random sampling can be done in any type of research, but it's most common in certain types of survey studies in which it's very important to get a high-quality sample. Random assignment is done in experimental research. It's done in all experiments because it's actually a part of the definition of an experiment. So let's start going down the list. As I go down the list, I'm going to be going back and forth just to help you compare and contrast the two types, random sampling and random assignment. So let's start with random sampling. Random sampling is an unbiased way of selecting participants from a population. So what's a population? A population is just a group of individuals that have something in common. An example of a population might be men. Another example of a population might be women. Another example of a population might be college students. These are all populations that a researcher might study at some point, and they're all groups of individuals that have something in common. When a researcher is doing a survey study and the researcher wants to learn about a population, the researcher will want to get an unbiased sample of that population so that the researcher can make a confident inference about the population as a whole. And, well, in a perfect world, a researcher who's studying a population would survey all members of that population. That way, everyone is surveyed and everyone's information is taken into account and there's no bias. I mean, there's no chance of reaching an incorrect conclusion unless some people were dishonest or unless some people just lied on the survey. But like I said, in a perfect world, a researcher would do that. But in a real life survey study, it's not possible to survey all members of a really big population because some people can't be contacted because they don't have contact information available. It's also too expensive to survey all members of a really big population, and it's way too time-consuming. So in reality, a survey researcher will take a selected group of population members who can participate and collect data from that selected group. And that selected group that actually takes the survey is called a sample of the population. And the population might be millions of people, and the sample might be a few hundred or maybe a few thousand. And The sample is basically the researcher's taste of the population. When a researcher surveys a sample to learn about the bigger population, that sample is like a taste of the population. The researcher uses the data from the sample to try to draw inferences about the bigger population. And when a researcher takes a sample and surveys a sample, the researcher can't just select any people he or she wants to. If a researcher wants a sample of a university, the researcher can't just go to a certain hallway, grab 5 people who happen to be there and say, "You're my sample, you're going to take my survey, and I'm going to use your data to reach a conclusion about the university." Because any conclusions about the university that are based on those 5 people won't be valid. It's important to get a unbiased, high-quality sample of a population. And a researcher who's doing a survey study will have the best possible chance of getting a representative sample if he or she does random sampling. Random sampling is a way of selecting a sample, and in random sampling, a researcher gives all population members an equal chance of being chosen. So random sampling is just any type of sampling strategy that gives all population members an equal chance of being chosen. And to give all population members an equal chance of being chosen, you have to do some type of lottery or random drawing in which people are selected by chance. A really simple example of random sampling is putting the names of population members into a hat, shaking it up, and taking out a certain number of pieces without looking. If I wanted to get a random sample of a class of 30 people, I could put all of their names into a hat, shake it up, and take out a certain number of individuals. And the selected group would be a random sample of the entire class of 30. If I pick out 5 pieces of paper out of the hat, those 5 people are a sample of the population of all 30 in the class. Now, that way of taking a random sample isn't practical when you're studying a really big population, like college students. It's practical if you're studying a really small population, like 30 people, and you can actually put their names into a hat, but it's not practical with a very big population. So if you're studying a very big population and you want to get a random sample, you have to do some other type of random sampling than drawing out of a hat. Another way of getting a random sample is by randomly selecting a certain number of social media profiles. Let's imagine that a researcher who wants to reach a conclusion about Instagram users, about the Instagram population. Maybe a researcher is interested in the average or mean number of hours that an Instagram user is on Instagram per day. Well, that researcher could get a random sample of Instagram users by just randomly selecting a certain number of social media Instagram profiles. The researcher could go online and do a random drawing to randomly select a certain number of Instagram profiles, and in that situation, all profiles would have an equal chance of being chosen, and profiles would be selected by chance, and the researcher would get a random sample. The profiles that actually end up being contacted would be a random sample. So I could go into more detail about other ways of taking a random sample, but I'm not going to do that now because that's not the point of this video. So just remember, in random sampling, it's a random chance drawing, like taking names out of a hat, and people are selected by chance. And random, so when I said random sampling is done when you're doing a survey study and you want to learn about a population and you want to get a good high quality sample of that population. Random assignment, on the other hand, is an unbiased way of assigning participants to groups during an experiment. So if a researcher is doing an experiment and the researcher wants to reach a cause and effect conclusion, then the researcher will do random assignment to split the participants into separate groups that then go into different conditions or situations, like a hot room and a cold room. If a researcher wanted to look at the effect of temperature on memory, the researcher would randomly assign the participants to two separate groups. The researcher would randomly split the participants into two separate groups. Then one group would go into a hot room, one group would go into a cold room, and then if one group does significantly better than the other and the experiment is done well, the researcher can make a confident cause and effect conclusion about temperature. And the random assignment is what allows the researcher to make that confident cause and effect conclusion. So when you think of random sampling, think of a really big population, like millions of people that a researcher is studying, and the researcher wants to take a very small fraction of that big population and survey that sample to reach a conclusion about the bigger population. When you think of random assignment, imagine a group of participants that are already selected. It's already a sample, and the researcher randomly splits it in half so that one group can go into condition 1 and one group can go into condition 2. So in random assignment, you have to already have a sample of participants, and then you randomly split the sample into different groups. So I said random sampling gives all population members an equal chance of being selected. Random assignment, on the other hand, gives each participant an equal chance of going to either group. So if an experiment has two groups, then each participant has a 50-50 chance of going to group 1 and a 50-50 chance of going to group 2. I said random sampling is used in certain types of survey research in which a representative sample is highly important and desired because it's very important to get an accurate conclusion about the population. And I said random assignment is used in all experimental studies. It's a part of an experiment. Point number 4 about random sampling says that random sampling is not common in experimental research due to practical reasons. So this gets back to how I said that random sampling and random assignment are not usually done together. So in an experiment with random assignment, random sampling is not typically done. In experimental research, it's almost always random assignment only with no random sampling. And so what a researcher typically does in a psychology experiment is a researcher gets a group of people who happen to be available, like let's say a classroom, or just some group of people who are available to participate. And it's not a random sample, it's called a convenience sample. And the researcher takes that convenience sample and randomly splits it into separate groups and does random assignment. So in an experimental study, what's almost always done is taking a non-random sample that just happens to be available and then doing random assignment on the convenience sample. And there's a few reasons for this. First of all, experiments tend to involve in-person data collection. In survey research, it's more common to send out a survey online through a Google form or something like that. And there are experiments that can also be done online through a website or something like that, but experiments are more likely to involve in-person data collection because some experiments simply can't be done online. For example, if you want to study the effect of sleep deprivation and you're having your participants go through a night of sleep deprivation, the participants have to be in a lab and supervised. That can't be done over the internet. So it's not practical to get a random sample of a broad population and then bring that random sample to a university and have them do an in-person experiment. If you're doing an experiment with in-person data collection, it's more practical to get a group of people who happen to be at the university and just bring them into the study, right? So that's one reason, is when you're doing in-person data collection during an experiment, it's much more practical to use a convenience non-random sample. Also, in an experiment, researchers tend to care more about the cause and effect conclusion, about the internal validity of the experiment, and the external validity is still important, but it's not as important to the researcher as the cause and effect conclusion. So that's why a researcher who's doing an experiment, well, it's one reason why a researcher who's doing an experiment won't take the effort to get a random sample of a broad population. So I think I've covered a couple of reasons why experimental research usually doesn't use random sampling. So now let's move ahead. Random assignment is not needed in survey research. And that's because the researcher doesn't need to form groups. In a survey study, the participants all take the same survey, and that's the task. For example, in a survey study on social media use, all participants would take the same survey on social media use. The participants wouldn't need to be sent into different situations or manipulated conditions. So there's no need to split the sample in half. So yeah, it's not needed in survey research. I said that random sampling helps a researcher get a representative sample, which is just a balanced variety of population members. So I'm on point 5 now for random sampling. A representative sample is a sample that has the right number of each type of person, the right number of men and the right number of women, the right number of younger people and the right number of older people. And when a researcher takes a random sample, especially a large random sample, the researcher is likely to get a representative sample, or at least a fairly representative sample. And let's move on to point number 5 for random assignment. Random assignment helps a researcher create groups that are similar to each other that can be placed into different conditions in an experiment. So if a researcher takes a sample of, let's say, 100 people and randomly splits it into 2 groups of 50, it's not likely that all of the men will go into group 1 and all of the females, women, will go into group 2. It's more likely that the males will be roughly equally split between the 2 groups, and the females will also be roughly equally split between the 2 groups. And it's likely that group 1 will be about half and half, and group 2 will also be about half and half. That's more likely to happen. So random assignment helps a researcher create roughly equal groups that are actually comparable in an experiment. In an experiment, you don't want to put, let's say, a group of children, in an experiment, you don't want to put a group of, let's say, marathon runners and have them run on a dirt track, and a group of non-runners and have them run on a rubber track, if you're trying to reach a conclusion about the running surface that they're running on, right? Because the marathon runners are obviously going to do better, and you're not going to be able to conclude anything about the effect of the surface that they're running on. So if one group is running on a rubber track and one group is running on a dirt track, and you want to see which track seems to be better for running speed, you want the 2 groups to be roughly similar in ability so that they can be compared. And random assignment would help you create 2 roughly equal groups of runners. It would help you create 2 groups of runners that are roughly equal in ability. And if one group does do significantly better than the other, you can confidently say that it was because of the surface that they were running on. Random sampling and random assignment are both, I'm on point number 6 now. Random sampling and random assignment are both more effective, more reliable with a bigger sample. So in random sampling, you're more likely to get a representative sample of a population if you randomly sample 100 than if you only randomly sampled 2 people, right? If you randomly sample 2 people, you might just get 2 18-year-old males, and you don't have a representative sample at all. But if you take 100, you're not likely to get 100 of one type of person just by chance. You're more likely to get some of each type of person. Also, I said random assignment is also more effective with a larger sample size. So if you, well, let me start with the most extreme example. If you take two individuals and you randomly assign them to two separate groups, there's no reason at all to expect the two groups to be similar, because if you take two people and you randomly assign them to two groups, well, you just have one person over here and one person over here, and they're just two individuals, right? And who knows if they're similar? If you take four people and you randomly assign them to two groups of two, two and two, you're still very unlikely to get equal groups, because you could end up getting you could end up getting two young males over here and two older females over here simply by chance. That wouldn't be surprising. But if you took 100 and randomly split it into two groups of 50, the 50 over here and the 50 over here are really likely to be roughly equal on a variety of things. Now let's move down. So random sampling allows a researcher to confidently reach a conclusion about a population in a survey study. It allows a researcher to confidently reach an inference about a bigger population, like an inference about social media use or something like that, but not with 100% certainty, so it's still an inference. Random assignment, on the other hand, allows a researcher to confidently reach a cause and effect conclusion, or a cause and effect inference, but not with 100% certainty. So notice how in random sampling and in random assignment, neither one have 100% certainty. So random sampling can fail from time to time, and random assignment can also fail to do its job from time to time. Because after all, random is random. Random, when you do something randomly, you get what you get, and it's not always going to work out the way you think or the way you hope. So that's part of why it's important for studies to be repeated, and for a study to confirm the result of an earlier study. If a line of studies all reach the same conclusion, then we get more and more confident that that conclusion is actually the truth. So let's move on to point number 8. So random sampling leads to higher external validity, because it allows a researcher to survey a sample and confidently reach an inference about the bigger population that the sample came from. It allows a researcher to confidently reach inferences about unobserved or unsurveyed population members who aren't actually in the sample. Random assignment, on the other hand, leads to higher internal validity. It allows a researcher to have two groups that can actually be compared, and for a researcher to be able to confidently say that the experimental manipulation is what caused the results, and that the results aren't caused by unknown differences between the two groups of people. So yeah, that's my overview of random sampling and random assignment. If you have any questions about the difference between them or about anything else I said, just let me know.